So then the next social identity, and out of all of them, I think, this is important. It's important points to make. They don't really give you any new gender strategies in this section, but it's really just kind of pointing out how a person's immigrant status, if they are a new immigrant, if they're first generation American or an immigrant here in America, how this might relate to their gender strategies. And they note that, in general, immigrants just already confront a lot of challenges in their new country, including xenophobia, where people are fearful and have unwarranted, hatred towards immigrants. So they already face all these challenges. So, the expectation that they do gender the right way in their new country, when perhaps the gender norms here are different in pretty significant ways than what was done in their previous country, that is a real challenge. And they highlight, kind of two ways in which you can see these challenges pop up in immigrant individuals. One of them, the kind of examples dealt with reconfigured families, that the breadwinner and family focused and supportive spouse and super mom, super dad, you perhaps were able to embody one strategy in your home country, but now that you're here in America, maybe your economic situation has changed. Maybe the opportunities available, especially particularly for women, maybe that has shifted and changed, and this might lead to the adoption of a new strategy. And they say that, this is something that sometimes families embrace together, and sometimes it's an issue that can tear families apart if one partner, liked the way that it used to be, and another partner wants to adopt a different strategy, a different gender strategy, now that they're in a new social context. The kind of other way that they talk about gender strategies related to immigrant status dealt with reconfigured sexualities. And so, what does it mean to be a sexual minority in this nation as opposed to your home country? So compared to some countries, particularly some African as well as some Latin and Asian countries, sexual minorities do have greater behavioral freedom and legal protection in this country than they do in other countries. And so that might lead people to adopt different gender strategies based on their sexual orientation than what was available to them in their home country. But then also, of course, there are countries that have, better attitudes, more tolerance, more legal protections than America. So people coming from those countries might have a different take on what gender strategies are necessary based on their sexual orientation status now that they're here in America. In general, kind of the big takeaway, I think, of this section is just the fact that, there is this flexibility and fluidity in gender strategies in the lives of immigrants just really emphasizes the importance of understanding that gender is based on social context. There are no hard and fast rules about gender. This is what it means when we talk about it being socially constructed. If you change, societies, then the constructions around masculinity and femininity are, of course, going to shift and change as well. I give you this graph just to kind of to support my point that, certainly under the Clinton and Obama years, and even in the George W. Bush years, but much less so under the Donald Trump presidency, a certain number of asylum spots were available to people who were sexual minorities and claimed, persecution in their home country. So, there has steadily been influx, or maybe influx is too strong of a word, maybe trickle, but there's steadily been a subgroup of immigrants who come to America expressly because they are sexual minorities and face dangers at home. So this discussion about, how do I do femininity and masculinity in light of my status as being a gay man or lesbian or pansexual, this has been a real, question, challenge that people in this country have faced. Then we have ability, as kind of being, the setting up this distinction between ability and disability. And so they talk about, the role of ableism, that we have a lot of negative stereotypes and bias, prejudice against people who have differently abled bodies. That people who are disabled are oftentimes disadvantaged in a lot of social settings, and they're disadvantaged when interacting with people, on in job interviews, on the dating market, just in general. We call this ableism, and particularly the question for in this section is really kind of focused on how can physical disabilities interfere with our ability to do gender. And so for men, it's that idea that it is hard to live up to the idea of hegemonic masculinity when you have a physical disability, whether that's severe, like paraplegic, quadriplegic, or even something even just less severe, just because we make those associations of manliness with strength and athletic ability, and aggressiveness, and all these kind of things that kind of are rooted in the idea that you're going to have a certain type of body that looks and works in a certain type of way. So men who have a physical disability are largely cut off from that. And so, your book talks about like two strategies in particular that they can employ. One is the strategy of what they call emphatically hetero. So they can kind of push back on being labeled as less than a man by making their heterosexuality very apparent and very central to their personality. And they talk about, the person, the guy that would hang all of the, semi-pornographic posters, and the one guy who flirted and made, chauvinistic comments to the female interviewer. They kind of assert themselves rather obnoxiously, let's be honest, in the one way that they still have available to them, and that's by being dismissive of women, treating women in this kind of sexist, chauvinistic way, by asserting their dominance in this fashion. Because of their physical limitations. Another way, and there isn't a particular gender strategy associated with this, but it's just the role of sports. Murder ball, which is basically, I think, like wheelchair rugby, but it's extremely aggressive and extremely violent. It allows the men that play to kind of embody that aggressiveness and that violence that we associated with men in male full contact sports, of course, like rugby and football and wrestling and hockey even. This gives them that option. And so that is a way for them to kind of support their masculinity. And then the final kind of strategy is what they call the able disabled, by emphasizing that you still are able to enjoy a lot of independence, that, you're able to still maybe, take care of yourself, make your own money, not rely on a caretaker. Because of course, being dependent, physically dependent, financially dependent, those are qualities that go against that hegemonic male ideal. So that's for masculinity. For femininity, it's a lot of things wrapped up in issues surrounding attractiveness, because it's the idea that a disabled body is an unattractive body. And if so much of femininity is being attractive to men, appealing to men, then that places these women, disabled women, in no woman's land. This idea of, can you really be feminine? Can you be a woman if you are found to be unattractive? And so how they respond to that, Some of them just kind of embrace that, they rejected, and they embrace that rejection. And they go on to say that they find it freeing. But then the kind of alternative response and opposite response is hyperconformity, doing girly girlness to the extreme, to the extent that you can do it. Full makeup, hair, dressy, dressiness, right? Going all in on that emphasized femininity. And I don't have it listed here, but another way to do emphasize femininity, of course, is instead of appearance, is, of course, you could do it in terms of caretaking and nurturing. And so they say, especially if it is a woman who is disabled, but she's married to a breadwinner husband, who, therefore her not being able to have a job because of her disability is less kind of economically consequential. Then it allows her to super embrace the family focused strategy, and the family focused strategy with its basis in being nurturing and doing the caretaking, it is, of course, inherently feminine. So, that is another way to embrace femininity outside of looks. The final section, identity, deals with age, and then they also loop in attractiveness to this section. So, before we start talking about attractiveness, let's just talk about age. What does it mean to be old? Used to be a lot more straightforward, and now, of course, you have sayings like 30 is the new 40, and or 40 is the new 30. Hold on, am I saying this backwards? 30 is the new 20. So therefore 40 is the new 30. And, you have people like J-Lo that look like, and Halle Berry that look super amazing into their 50s and have bodies that, we would associate with 20-year-olds. So, and in terms of like retiring, you have people retiring later and later in life, usually out of economic necessity. So just know that, like everything, that the answer to that question, what does it mean to be old? I mean, it is a social construct. Like, yes, age is real. You're going to age, but those designations of young, middle age, old, those are constructs. So society is going to define that differently over time. It's going to define it differently, based on specific country. Typically, in our country, we've kind of talk generally about oldness starting around retirement age, which traditionally has been around early to mid 60s. So, you could think about the older years being kind of broken into kind of two different time periods. There's the transitional older years that begin in the early to mid 60s as people, retire, or if not retire, begin to slow down their work commitments. At this age, people are less likely to have young dependent children, so they've kind of moved and shifted out of that part of their life, and so they're in transition. And then we move into the later older years, which is age 75 on, and usually the assumption is by the time you reach your later older years that you have kind of moved out of a lot of these like social roles kind of related to employment. Of course, in our country, we have so many older people in our politics, and we are having increasingly, greater numbers of older actors, and even parents have gotten older. So none of this is quite as straightforward as it used to be. And at least part of this has a lot to do with the fact that we're living to be older and older. We have had an increase in what we call centenarians. And so centenarians are people who live to be over the age of 100. And you can kind of see there that compared to the early 2000s, going into 2020, we've almost tripled the number of centenarians that we have in our society. I remember growing up in the 80s, that Bob Hope used to wish people who turned 100, he would like wish them, happy birthday on his TV show, because there were so few of them back then. He really could, name them, rattle off their names. And not only do we have a rise in centenarians, we have seen an increasing number of super centenarians, people who are 110 and older. And, like 20, 30 years ago, that was unheard of. Now, there is a real gender gap as people, reach these older years, certainly a gender gap in the later older years where, it's 9 women to every 1 man. Women do live longer in this country. And so, maybe I think that's an important fact to consider as we now move into our discussion of age and attractiveness, because we have more and more people in our society living to be older. We have older people that are in important positions in politics as well as business. People aren't retiring as early as they used to. We don't have mandatory retirement in this country. So people can stay in the job, they can stay, as long as they like, but what they do risk facing is, ageism, which is an institutionalized preference for the young and the cultural association of aging with kind of decreased social value. And we see this in the job market. We also see this in the dating market. Now, how does all this relate to gender? That's because aging is gendered. Most of our gender rules are age related. At what age do we expect women to wear makeup? At what age do we expect women to wear high heels? And at what age do we expect them to stop? At what age should women be trying to be sexy? And then at what age does it become desperate? And at what age does it become sad? What age do we expect, men to be players? And at what age does it, once again, become kind of sad and desperate? We have these age-related gender roles. And so a way to think about it is our gender rules are age differentiated, and then our age rules are gender differentiated. So some of the same things that we expect from older women aren't necessarily the same things that we expect from older men. And some of the allowances that we make for young men are different than the allowances we make for young women. And so a good example of this is kind of like how we think about relationships between older individuals and younger individuals. When it's an older man and a younger woman, this is much more culturally acceptable and expected. We even have a nice little term for it. We call them May-December relationships. And, sometimes people may remark if it's a truly like outlandish age difference. But usually people oftentimes don't bat an eye. It probably would not be very difficult for you to quickly Google, or even just off the top of your head, to generate a list of older movie stars who have male movie stars who have much younger female partners, or even just thinking about it in terms of the media itself, the number of movies and TV shows that partner older men with younger women. But then when you think about the converse, older women and younger men, as your book notes, there becomes this hint of scorn and derision. We have the term cougar. We don't even have that type of, similar term for men. There's this sense that, older women that engage in this type of behavior are desperate or sad and delusional. They talk about how, unlike when older men marry younger women internationally, this isn't questioned, but when older women do it, there's this assumption that they're being used, and that's sad. And all of this relates to the fact that for women, there is this expectation as they age that they are not attractive anymore, and therefore do not deserve to be visible in the larger social context, the grandma strategy. And women who do not embrace the grandma strategy are largely like painted as being desperate and delusional. We don't think about this for men, as your book notes, especially for upper class men who are able to age gracefully. We think about them as being the distinguished gentleman, and there's this class aspect to that. And there's something similar for women. They call them the grand dames, but for women, like I said, there is less acceptance around the idea that an older woman can be attractive. So, she could age gracefully. People might say she looks good for her age or she's taking care of herself, but there's still kind of this underlying assumption that she isn't going to be attractive, particularly to younger men. While distinguished gentlemen, that is not necessarily that is not necessarily the underlying assumption. Think about how people, described men like Sean Connery or Paul Newman, men like that, and until the later years of their life, even Clint Eastwood, right? They still describe them in terms of their virility and attractiveness, and even women who it's largely assumed have aged well, like Jane Fonda, people still don't talk about them as being attractive, particularly to younger men. As your book notes, a lot of this is mediated by social class, because whether you're a man or a woman, in order to age in that type of way where you've taken care of yourself, it usually probably means that you didn't have the type of job that was hard on your body, that you could afford good food and exercise and skincare and maybe even plastic surgery later. And that relates to social class. Now, they do say for working class men, they can't necessarily be distinguished gentlemen because maybe they had jobs and led lives that were much harder on their body, harder on their appearance, but they can be within their family the patriarch, right? Wise old granddad, wise old pawpaw, pap pap, whatever you want to call him. And that there is still kind of more power and social value in being the patriarch than there is to being the grandma, which are, the working class, working poor women who don't have the social resources that allow them to be the grand dames, to be able to kind of hold on to that, to those kind of beauty related expectations as they enter into their 60s and their 70s. And so, we end this chapter with this final kind of quote: gender isn't crowded out by other characteristics because it doesn't compete with those things. It colludes with them. Gender intersects with our other socially salient identities, inflecting them with gendered meaning, and every social position allows for different combinations of distinctions that carry cost and rewards. As we carve our masculine or feminine identity, we develop strategies designed to manage all these expectations, constraints, and opportunities.